Hey guys, this is Z, coming back at you with another deck tech here today. Today we're looking at the precon for the Buckle Up Commander deck from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. In this case, we'd obviously want to make a bunch of, Tokyo Drift jokes and things like that, and while I may be a better person than that, I can't speak for Zed. I know he loves that franchise, so if you see any memes or anything else come up, that's probably his doing, but basically, this set was just chock full of some fun vehicle love, bunch of new cards that relate to it, and so they gave us the precon to go along with it. So, what better place to start than our commander? We have Katori, Pilot Prodigy, 1 a white, a blue, for 2/4 Moonfolk Pilot. Vehicles you control have crew 2, as opposed to the traditional crew cost. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, target artifact creature you control gains lifelink and vigilance till end of turn. So, if you really wanted to, this commander could speak to you to go a couple of different ways. It could just lean into the vehicle tribal, which we definitely did here, but you could also say, hey, artifact creatures matter. And in a way, we kind of did that as well, because vehicles are going to be artifact creatures. So, we'll just go through our list of cards here, and much like with the Upgrades Unleashed precon video that should be coming out around the same time here, this deck doesn't have a lot of sorceries, doesn't have a lot of instants. It's very, very permanent driven. And if you ever were interested in the cards we took out, that sideboard is going to have that information listed, minus a bunch of the lands. Basic land swaps or land swaps in general, I didn't feel for this one were really worth noting too much. But the goal was to try to get these roughly in a decent shape. So the first creature we're going to kind of cover here today is Chief Engineer. It's 1 in a blue for Vidalcan Artificer, 1/3. Artifact creatures, or artifact spells in general you control have Convoke. So basically you can tap them down to pay for a mana. Now, this deck does have a big tap, untap sub-theme here. Primarily it's a tap sub-theme. And that's going to kind of play into one of our win conditions a little bit later on in the artifact section. But that way I kind of explained that a little bit ahead of time, that hey, we do want to be tapping our things down and, if possible, untapping them to get that extra value. The next card in our list is going to be Ethereum Sculptor. Artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. It itself is an artifact creature, 1/2 for 2 mana. So again, we're playing a large number of artifacts. We kind of want to make them, cheaper, get them out into play, and rely on their synergies to get that extra value. Next up, then we have Gold and Silver Mirror, both at 2 mana, both tap and add either a white or a blue. Gold gives white, Silver gives blue, to your mana pool for a 1/1 creature. Afterwards, we have SRAM, Senior Artificer, or Edificer. It is 1 and a white for Legendary Dwarf Artificer. Whenever you cast an aura equipment, in this case, the one we care about is going to be Vehicle Spell, draw a card for 2 mana, 2/2. Then we have the Vidalcan Engineer, 1 and a blue. Tap, add 2 mana of any color to your mana pool of 1 color. Spend this mana only to play artifacts or activated ability of artifacts. So this is some blue ramp, but we're using it primarily for artifacts. Well, we're secretly an artifact deck, so kind of on theme. So the next card we have here is going to be Cosmina, God of the Voyage, as well as the flip side, the Omen Keel. So the Omen Keel itself is a vehicle, 2 mana cost for a 3/3. Whenever a vehicle you control deals combat damage to a player, that player will exile that many cards from the top of their library, and you may play lands from among those for as long as they remain exiled. So we're going to steal some lands from our opponents. Or, as just the front side, beginning of your upkeep, you may exile it. If you do, it gains whenever your land enters the battlefield under your control. If it's exiled, you may put a voyage counter on it. If you don't, you get to return it to the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it, and draw X cards, where X is the number of voyage counters on it. So, it's going to allow you to draw some cards on the front side. The next card we kind of left here was the Drum Bellower. Spirit Flyer for 3 mana, 2/1. Untap all creatures you control during each other player's untap step. So it's kind of like a Seedborn Muse for your creatures. However, it does play into the synergy we have with this deck, and in theory will allow us to kind of tap our creatures to get vehicles for defense. Next up, we have Emery, Lurker, Glock. She's a 3-mana 1/2, cost 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. When it enters the battlefield, you can put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. Tap and choose an artifact in your graveyard. You may cast that card this turn. So you'll still pay its cost, you'll still have timing rules, but it allows you to kind of reanimate artifacts out of the graveyard and play them that way. Since we're so heavy... Oh, sorry about that, guys. Since we're so heavy into the artifacts here, we also included a Foundry Inspector. It's going to make our artifacts cost 1 less to cast for a 3/2 for 3. It itself is an artifact. We also have Hana, Ship's Navigator, for 1 a blue and a white, for 1/2 Human Artificer. And then 1 blue, a white, tap. Return target artifact or enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. So it's going to grant us a little bit of form of recursion. Next card we're looking at is the Master of Ethereum, 2 and a blue. Vidalcan Wizard, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of artifacts you control. It also grants other artifact creatures you control +1/+1. He himself being an artifact, he's going to come in as a minimum 1/1. Then we have the Moonfolk Puzzlemaker. It's a 2 and a blue for a 1/4 Merfolk Wizard. Whenever it becomes tapped, scry 1. So this makes one of the things we can crew vehicles with pretty decent. It's going to let us scry every time we crew a vehicle with it. Next up, we have Psy, Master Thopterist. When you cast an artifact spell, you get to create a 1/1 colorless Thopter with flying. Then you can pay 1, a blue, sacrifice 2 artifacts, and draw a card. So, again, we're basically just kind of using this in order to draw cards, keep our game going, and keep playing. Next up, we have the Aeronaut Admiral. He is a 3/1 for 4 mana, human pilot. He's got flying, but he also gives vehicles you control flying. This is not an Admiral of the Sea. He is an Admiral of the Air. So, next up, we have Draw Scorpion. 4 mana, 3/1. Whenever it or another artifact creature is put into a graveyard from play, you may untap target artifact. Again, we kind of want to play around with tapping and untapping. And our payoff is in our artifact section, so we'll get to it a little bit later, but that way you know what we're looking for. Next up, we have Katsumasa the Animator, 2 and 2 blue for 3/3 Moonfolk Artificer, flyer, 2 and a blue until end of turn. Target non-creature artifact you control becomes an artifact, creature, and gains flying. If it's not a vehicle, it gets pace, power, and toughness of 1/1 until the end of turn. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you can put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 3 target non-creature artifacts. So this might be a fun commander to build around if you're wanting to do something like turn your Soul Ring into a beater and beat people to death with it, or do something with like Bloodstained Axe and stuff like that. So this is a really fun commander. It's got some gimmicky things you can do. I appreciate it coming out, but ultimately, for the most part, I'm primarily using it here as a way to kind of turn some of our other artifacts on, or to give us a way we can pay mana to activate our vehicles. Next up, we have a card that I'm just pretty fond of myself, and that's going to be Master Transmuter, 3 and a blue, artifact creature, human artificer for 1/2. Blue, tap, return an artifact you control to its owner's hand. You may put an artifact from your hand onto the battlefield. So in a way, it's bouncing an artifact you control and paying a small tax, but you can put whatever other artifact you want onto the battlefield. In this deck, some of the scary things you would be able to, in theory, do that's not in here would be like a drop of Blightsteel Colossus. Obviously, I didn't include it in here. I didn't feel that was fair game with what I was doing with these precons, but if that's what you like, if that's what you're about, or that's what you want to do, certainly an option. Next up, we have Sanctum Gargoyle, which is a 2/3 for 4 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you can return an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Then we have the Solemn Simulacrum, 4 mana, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped. When it dies, you get to draw a card. So it's a simple effect, but it's pretty decent. Then we have Tashar, Ancestor's Apostle. It's a 4-mana 2/2 bird cleric flyer. When it casts a historic spell, which would be an artifact, legendary, or saga, return target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Basically, it's going to let us go ahead and recur some of our lower cost things here on the end. Then I went ahead and put in a Vedalken Archmage, 2 and 2 blue, for a 0/2 Vedalken Wizard. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, draw a card. This deck has a high density of artifacts, so we're going to be drawing a lot of cards in theory. We also have Whirler Rogue, 2 and 2 blue. When it enters the battlefield, it gets to create 2 1/1 colorless Thopters, and then you can tap 2 untapped artifacts you control. Target creature can't be blocked. You can use that as a kind of a sneaky way to give your opponent's creatures unblockable if they're attacking another opponent who's a threat, or you can use it to make your guys unblockable. So it's just worth thinking about. Next up, we have Cataclysmic Gearhulk, 3 and double white for an artifact creature construct, Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, each player will choose an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker from among the non-land permanents they control, and then sacrifice the rest. This deck, we can kind of utilize this in a sneaky way, because in our creature slot, most of our creatures are also artifacts, so we can generally save 2 artifact creatures, or things like that. So just something to think about. The next one we have here is Iron Soul Enforcer. 4 and a green for a 4/4 human samurai artifact creature. Whenever it or a commander you control attacks alone, return target artifact card from the graveyard to the battlefield. So this is definitely relying or wanting to be with the commander, but at the same time, he can also trigger this ability all on his own. He doesn't need anyone else to help him out to do that. And it's another recursion effect. So I'll be up front with you. This deck really could probably use some good artifact sacrifice, but I did not want to break the bank to do that. There is a payoff artifact sacrifice card here coming up, but if you can afford it, Clark Clan Ironworks may be a fun card to kind of reward or pay off the whole recursion package we're including. But because it's so price prohibitive, I did not want to include it on this list. Just something to keep in mind. Next up, we have Cadolpha Forgemaster, which is tap, sacrifice 3 artifacts, search your library for an artifact card, and put it onto the battlefield. Then shuffle your library for a 3/5 5-mana cost construct. Basically, this is one of our sacrifice outlets. It's going to allow us to pitch 3 artifacts on the board, but go find any artifact we want and put it into play. We don't necessarily need to put it in our hand and cast it later. Next up, we have Research Thief from the Precon as well, 4 and a blue for a 3/3 Moonfolk Wizard, flash flying. Whenever an artifact creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. So we've got a bunch of artifact creatures. Us being able to deal damage with artifact creatures is pretty straightforward. So I think it's nice for us to be able to have that as a form of kind of more reliable draw, much like we would with like a Coastal Piracy or a Reconnaissance Mission type effect. Next up, we have the Cyberdrive Awakener for 5 mana and a blue, 4/4 flying construct. Other artifact creatures you control have flying. When it enters the battlefield until end of turn, each non-creature artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness of 4/4. Basically, he's going to wake up and activate all these other artifacts and turn them into some creatures to be a threat. It's a really good way to swing a board state, or kind of go, okay, so he's only got 1 blocker. You play that, things come in. Not only are they 4/4s, they also have flying. They can be a nasty threat. Next up, we have Solanoophorexia at 6 mana, 6/6 for a Trampler Avatar. 5 mana permanents you control gain indestructible until the end of the turn. But if it's in the graveyard, you can pay 5 mana and exile it from your graveyard. Permanents you control gain indestructible till the end of turn. It's a protection effect that you can use multiple times. As long as you got it on the board, you can keep using it. If it's in your graveyard, you can use it once. Next up, we're going to kind of talk about some of these sorceries and instants. First off, the sorcery, we have Dance of the Manse. That's going to be X white blue. Return up to X target artifact and or non-aura enchantment cards, each with converted mana cost X or less, from your graveyard to the battlefield. If X does happen to be 6 or more, those permanents are 4/4 creatures in addition to their other types. So basically it's a recursion that if we scale it up high enough, we can also go ahead and bring over various different, we can also turn them into creatures to be aggressive game enders. The next card we're looking at here is going to be Universal Surveillance. It's X blue, blue, blue with sorcery with improvise. So the triple blue may look intimidating, but realistically it's just triple blue, whatever we want to tap down, and however extra mana we want to pay into it. Then we get to draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures we tap down or extra mana we pay into it. So in theory, this could just be a massive hand refill. After that, we have Thoughtcast, which is a sorcery artifact affinity. So it's 4 and a blue normally, but it costs 1 less for each artifact you control. It's possible it could just be a 1 mana draw 2. In this case, it just draws us 2 cards, and it can do that very, very cheaply. After that, we have the Organic Extinction. 8 white, white. Sorcery with improvise. So again, your artifacts can tap to help pay for the cost, and it destroys all non-artifact creatures. So, pretty nice. It's going to help us kind of clear the board of the nasty organic stuff that we don't want, so our machines can kind of take over. This is the perfect thing for Skynet. Next up in the instance section, we have Dispatch. Because we're going to pretty commonly have Metalcraft here with 3 or more artifacts, it's just an creature exile. But if not, it can at least tap down something. We also have Swords to Plowshares included in the deck. So it's a creature exile that allows your opponent to gain life equal to its power, but you get rid of the threat. Then at 2 mana, we have Armed and Armored. It's going to allow your vehicles to become artifact creatures until end of turn. You can also choose any dwarf you control, attach any number of equipment you control to it. Here's a hint, we're probably not running a lot of equipment in this deck. This is more so for the vehicles becoming artifact creatures. Next up, we have Reality Shift, which will exile a target creature that we don't like, and its controller gets to manifest the top card of their library. So it'll put it on the top. They'll put the top card of their library on the battlefield face down as a 2/2. If it's a creature, they can just pay its mana and it'll flip face up. So in theory, this can backfire on you, but it's one of those, if it's needed or if you really wanted to, you can always try to take advantage and get rid of the big, nasty, scary threat. Last but not least, we have Generous Gift. Destroy target permanent, its controller gets a 3/3 green elephant creature token. So is there a threat we don't want to deal with or that's nasty for us? We'll just get rid of it. Because the artifacts are so core to the deck, I'm actually going to skip over them and go to our enchantments and come back to the artifacts. So, our first enchantment is still from the precon. It's Swift Reconfiguration. It's 1 white mana, enchant Aura Flash, and you get to enchant a creature or a vehicle. The enchanted permanent is a vehicle artifact with crew 5, and it loses all other card types. So, in a way, you can use this to kind of lock down a creature. You can use it to lock down a vehicle, and it's really just a kind of a pain to deal with. So it's just something to keep in mind there. The next one we added here was Tempered Steel. Artifact creatures get +2/+2 for 3 mana. This is kind of me just wanting to throw in Tempered Steel into a deck and play around with it. But I think actually in this deck, where we're relying on our vehicles to do a lot, all these vehicles being artifacts, and all our other creatures being heavily enthused by artifacts, this is just a tribal buff. Much like we'd run Anthem effect in the tribal decks, I think Tempered Steel is here for these artifacts. Last here we have Thopter Spy Network. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control an artifact, which we probably will, you get to put a 1/1 colorless Thopter with flying onto the battlefield. Whenever one or more artifact creatures you control deal combat damage, you can then draw a card. So it's going to draw us cards when our creatures deal combat damage if they are an artifact, which we are playing a high density of. Going into our artifacts, because this is the section where this is a lot of the meat and potatoes of the deck, so to speak. Starting off, we have Soul Ring, which we all kind of know by this point. Arcane Signet adds a mana of your commander's color identity. There's already a Signet, 1 mana, tap it. You'll add both a white and a blue. Felwar Stone, add a mana to your mana pool for a land that of a mana that one of your opponent's lands can produce. And then I'm trying to avoid our vehicles because I'm going to cover that lineup last. We have Sculpting Steel to make a copy of any artifact on the battlefield, whether that's one of our vehicles that we want or whether that's one of our payoffs. We also have Blink Moth Urn. At the beginning of each player's pre-combat main phase, if it's untapped, that player adds colorless to their mana pool for each artifact he or she controls. And then our primary way we're going to try to round out some games. We have the legendary artifact Throne of the God Pharaoh. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent will lose life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. Since we're going to be tapping the crew vehicles, you're going to have a lot of tapped creatures. Ultimately, those tapped creatures will then allow us to ping our opponents out for damage, plus our combats should grind the opponents to dust, and that way we can come out on top. What vehicles are we going to be using to get there? Well, we've already covered the first one with Cosmina, but we also have the Imposter Mech, which enters the battlefield as a copy of a creature or a copy of a creature an opponent controls, except it's a vehicle with crew 3 and loses all other card types. You have the Mobilizer Mech, which is a 2 mana 3/4 flyer. Whenever it becomes crewed, up to one other vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So if you crew it, it crews something else, or it'll allow something else to be activated. We included the Reckoner Bankbuster. So 2 mana 4/4 enters the battlefield with 3 charge counters on it. 2 mana tap, remove a charge counter. You get to draw a card. If there are none left on it, you get to create a treasure. And a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. And then it's a crew 3 vehicle. If you're around in Standard at this time, you kind of remember what a little menace this thing was, that we got our little copter. Smuggler's Copter, 2 mana 3/3 flyer. When it attacks or blocks you may draw a card. If you do, you discard. And it's only a 1 for a crew cost. So it gets out of it's one of the cheaper end type vehicles to like crew and use, but it can get you some sneaky value. Next up we have Aerial Surveyor, 2 and a white, I should say, for a 3/4 vehicle. It's flying. Whenever it attacks, if defending player controls more lands than you, you get to search your library for basic lands, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. It's also a crew cost of 2. Then we also have Cultivators Caravan, 3 mana cost 5/5 vehicle. Tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, but it's also a crew 3. So the Caravan's also going to operate as like a Manalith or just a mana rock for us to help generate some mana and keep the game going. Next up, we have Imperial Recovery Unit. That's 2 mana white for a 3/4 artifact vehicle. When it attacks, you can return target creature or vehicle with a converted mana cost of 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. And it's a crew cost of 2. So it's going to help us get a lot of these lower cost things on the curve back. Again, recursion's a pretty big theme in this deck, so realistically, the deck does crave something to do with that recursion. We do have the Cadolpha Forge Master, but like I said, I would like to add a Krark Clan Ironworks. I just couldn't justify that kind of cost on an initial modification of the precon. Maybe when you're a little bit more in depth and you kind of feel more comfortable with what the deck wants to do, that may be worth when you consider that. Next up, we have Peace Walker Colossus. It's a 3 mana 6/6, 1 and a white. can make another target vehicle you control become an artifact creature until the end of turn, so it can help activate your vehicles. It's also got a crew cost of 4, so ultimately they're going to kind of keep this train rolling along and help us get new things. And then we have the Prodigies Prototype, which is going to be a 3 mana cost, 3/4 vehicle. Whenever one or more vehicles you control attack, you get to create a 1/1 pilot, colorless creature. With this creature, crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater, so it crews 3 for a cost of crew 2 on that vehicle. We also have a Raider's Carve, 3 mana cost, 4/4 vehicle. When it attacks, you get to look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, you can put it on the battlefield tapped. And its crew cost is going to be 3. So, if you kind of notice, the big thing is we're kind of trying to just get things crewed, get them tapped, and keep the attack and aggression up. Ultimately, these two precons pair really weird with how they want to go, because they both want to be aggressive, but they want to do it in different ways. I decided here that I wanted this one to be much more of a longer, grindier thing, where I wanted the upgrades Unleashed to be a much faster, hyper-aggressive type deck. This one's just going to try to eke out as much advantage as it can over the long run, if you were facing the two precons that I've modified head-to-head, so to speak. Next up, we have Shorchai Genesis Engine, 2 white-blue for an 8/8 legendary artifact vehicle. It has the special rule, it can be your commander. So, in case you were wondering, yes, this is a valid commander. And it's 1 tap, you get to draw 2 cards, then discard a card. You get to put a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token on the battlefield, and it's got this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. It can also crew for 8. So, it's kind of a high crew cost, but it's going to help fuel that by giving you some pilots. Next up, we have Surge Hacker Mech. It's going to be a 4 mana cost, 5/5 vehicle with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, it deals damage up to twice the number of vehicles you control to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and it's crew 4. So, basically, it's a removal spell on a creature, or on a vehicle in this instance, based on the number of vehicles you actually control here. So, it kind of helps you clear the board and let your vehicles get in for some damage. Next up, we have the Weatherlight, which is a 4 mana cost, 4/5 legendary artifact vehicle. It's got crew 3, it's a flyer, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library. You can then reveal a historic card from among them, put it in your hand, and the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. So those historic cards are going to be legendaries, artifacts, and sagas. This deck, it's going to find us a legendary card, or it's going to find us an artifact. The last kind of big vehicle we're running here is going to be the Perelian 2, which is a 6 and 2 white converted mana cost vehicle for 5/5. It's a legendary vehicle with flying, first strike, vigilance. Whenever it attacks, you get to create 2 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance that come into play, or that are attacking. And it's a crew 4 to be able to crew it up and get it moving. So this is just a big splashy payoff bomb for the vehicles. And ultimately, again, it's all about, sorry about that. Things are just kind of falling all over my office here today. So ultimately, the big update here, or the big thing with it, is it's more so they do want to be aggressive, but they want to be a smart one in how they're aggressive. As for our land base, we have 14 islands, 12 plains, and then for the purposes of mana filtering, we've got Command Tower, Exotic Orchard. We added the Glacial Fortress here. We added a Hollowed Fountain. We added Irrigated Farmland. We've got Port Town, Prairie Stream, Sky Cloud Expanse, and Temple of Enlightenment. The deck also includes a Spire of Industry, so it taps for 1 colorless to your mana pool, but you can tap and pay a life. Add a color of any color to your mana pool, but only if you control an artifact. So it's kind of like a Mana Confluence if you have artifacts. We also have a Buried Ruin in the deck for some utility to recur another artifact for us. Obviously, the more expensive version that we'd upgrade there would be something like an Academy Ruins. But this is kind of meant to be a very preliminary look at updating or upgrading this deck. So overall, that's kind of the buckle up precon that we're working with here today. This one went through a little bit quicker than the Upgrades Unleashed because there was a lot more to explain with that one. This one's kind of a little bit more straightforward. It's a bunch of artifact creatures. We kind of want to just be tapping our stuff down to activate our vehicles. Our vehicles will go into attack, get those tapped down, and then ultimately Throne of the God Pharaoh should just drain our opponents, plus the combat damage should help us get there. But at this point, that's really all there is to it here. That's been the 2 precons here for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. If you have any other comments or concerns, definitely let us know. But at the meantime, my main thing is I just try to focus the 2 decks on being balanced against each other. They're going to play very similarly, so it's all about momentum swings and what happens where. This blue-white deck has all the opportunity in the world to swing momentum, and the red-green deck is all about recovering from that momentum swing. So they balance themselves out pretty well in a vacuum that I found so far in my playtesting. But y'all let me know below. And again, remember, this is not the comprehensive end-all be-all guide. This is just something where if you're picking up the precons fresh, you want to look into it, you want to kind of get an idea, you just grab it, you can look at this and go, okay, here's a couple of ideas. These are what, okay, I like this, or hey, I don't really like this, let's try something different. It kind of gives you a gauge of what you're thinking. But I know we've got a couple of other projects here in the works. These are just the main 2 that I need to try to make sure I got to y'all. I am still working on the Crimson Vow ones. Those were delayed, obviously, by Zed's tragic situation. And then, obviously, I want to kind of go back and hit some of the older precons as well, as time permits. In the meantime, though, we're also working on other deck techs and other projects here on the channel. So even if Magic's not your thing, we do want to try to bring up other content. Or if you're into Magic but you don't really care for these deck techs, you really are more so interested in like the philosophy behind some parts of deck building, or if you're interested more in openings, well, we're going to try to be bringing all that as well. So just let us know in the comments section below what y'all might like to see. But in the meantime, this has been Z. This has been Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Buckle up, take care, stay safe, and hopefully Zed doesn't drop too much of a Tokyo Drift reference in the editing stage of this video. Take care, and peace.